Welcome to our interview with Mike Roberts, the author of The Last Keeper at Split Rock. Thank you so much for coming in. You have the distinction of being the last lighthouse keeper at the iconic Split Rock Lighthouse on Lake Superior.
Mm-hmm.
Did you see that coming when you were doing your tour of duty there?
No, not at all. We were blindsided as far as them closing it. Didn't have a clue. It would just be like somebody that would call you up when you got home and say, Lori, you're out of your house.
Yeah.
You're done.
Right.
And that's how it happened.
Because you lived there too. Oh my gosh.
27 months I lived there.
Oh my gosh. Well, let's spool it back and talk about what was going on in your life that led you to the Coast Guard.
Wow. Well, I was a pipe fitter, and a pipe fitter is a critical civilian skill, and I was working in Detroit. So when you have a critical civilian skill, you're not susceptible to the draft, plus I was married.
Okay.
So I left the job, I went to northern Minnesota, to Ely.
And what year was this?
This was in 1965.
Okay.
And so my wife and I got married in 1964, and so at that time, married men were not susceptible to the draft. Well, President Johnson changed the rules with an executive order in 65 and said anybody who did not have children that was married is now susceptible to the draft. So I was working in the mining company, and I was a diesel mechanic, which was not a critical civilian skill. And so
I wonder who comes up with these lists.
Yeah.
But we're stuck with it, right? I mean, that was the rule,
what do you
policy,
do?
The law.
Yeah, and that's the way it was. So they were drafting married men who had no children. And so we talked about it at the mine, about it. Some of the guys were getting their notice. And so I went to the draft board to see what was going on. And the little old lady, when I told her who I was, she went and looked through the files and said, oh yeah, she said, just as soon.
Here's your letter.
Yeah, just as soon as you go down and take your physical and pass, you have 21 days and you'll be inducted into the service. I said, ooh, that's not good. So I got my notice, I went and took my physical, passed with flying colors.
Lucky you.
Yeah, went back to see to make sure that I had passed with flying colors. And she said, yeah, she said, you have 21 days when you get your draft notice. So I said, oh. So I went down to Hibbing in Virginia, because I was living in Ely, and I went to see the recruiters. Well, I went to the Air Force, the guy laughed. He said, you ain't got a chance. I went to see the Navy, and they said, no. Air Force, same thing. All of them said the same thing, and
because you were trying to avoid the Army.
Well,
if possible.
let me tell you why. Okay, when I went down to take my physical, there were hundreds and hundreds of men that were taken to the Minneapolis building, the federal building. Mm-hmm. And what they did is they lined us up in the hallway, a huge long hallway. And they had the guys who were going to be inducted on one side, they're going to be drafted, and the other guys that are going to take their physical were on the other side. So as we're standing there, we're watching the guys that are going to be inducted. The sergeant in charge says to everybody, he said, count off by tens. So they started 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, 10, went all the way down the line till the last guy. They said all the tens take one step forward. So the tens took one step forward. He said, congratulations, gentlemen, you're in the Marine Corps. Well, I had a cousin who had just gotten out of the Marines, and he said, whatever branch of service you go into, do not go in the Marines. He said, because they just train you to be a killer. And he said, you're going to Vietnam? No doubt about it.
No doubt about it.
So, geez, now what am I going to do? So now I'm trying to figure out how I can serve.
Strategizing.
Yeah,
you're going to serve. You're committed to
I'm going to serve because
but
I couldn't run off to Canada like a lot of guys were doing. Yeah. And so I looked around and I checked all my options. And the last guy I saw was a Coast Guard recruiter in Duluth, I think it was Hibbing. And I talked to the guy and he said, I'm really sorry. He said, I'm booked up for 2 years. And he said,
with people wanting
to get in, sure, they're signed up, yeah. And so I said, well, okay, thanks a lot. So I turned around and I was going to leave, and just as I reached my hand for the door, he said, hey, wait a minute. He said, I have a guy who is supposed to go in April, but I don't think he's going to go. He said, if he doesn't go, will you take his slot? And I said, sure.
Yes.
I'd take his place. You bet I would.
Right, so, a married man, living in the Midwest. You just did not want to be put onto a cargo lift over to Vietnam. Okay.
And so I said, you bet. And so he sent a postcard to the draft board and to stop them from drafting me because I had enlisted in the Coast Guard. So then my time came, and I brought my wife back to Detroit, and then I flew to Philadelphia. From there I went to Cape May, New Jersey, and that's where I took my basic training. And that was in 66.
66, but this is a very good lesson that you've just imparted here, and that is, sometimes it's right to go with the flow, but it sometimes is okay to interfere a bit with the process. Like if you would have just kind of gone with the flow of things.
to try to influence what was going to happen.
Right, and it still was all completely ethical, completely
Absolutely.
within the, I mean, you found your way.
I just chose a different path.
Right.
When I was in the mine, there was a fellow by the name of Clarence Lossing, and Clarence was just one of the guys that was sitting around. He went to Vietnam and he never came back. He got killed. And we talked about it when we were there, and he said, you know, he knew that he was going to be inducted. And he said, I don't care. He said, I'm not married. He said, I just signed my insurance over to my mother. He said, I don't care. And he never made it back, which is really sad.
I mean, that was the era.
Yeah, 58,000 guys were killed in Vietnam. So I feel very fortunate to come back alive. And it might sound goofy being in the Coast Guard, but that was my main goal when I went into the service, was to come back alive.
Yeah.
And when I was in the service, 2 guys were killed in the line of duty in Duluth and in Grand Marais.
Okay, so you're doing your basic training, and then where were you first stationed? And was your wife with you initially? How does that work?
I took my basic in Cape May, and then what they do in the end of basic, they give you what's called a dream sheet, and you fill it out, and you have 3 choices to where you want to go. So I chose Alaska, I chose Hawaii, and I chose the Great Lakes. So
I might have put Hawaii number 1.
Yeah, and I did. But anyway, out of 120 guys, out of my 2 companies that I was with, I was the only guy that came back to the Great Lakes. The rest of them went on icebreakers out of Boston, which is really kind of interesting. So I got orders to Cleveland. I went to Cleveland. From there, I got orders to Duluth. And I went to Duluth, and I was on search and rescue at the Duluth Lifeboat Station, which is down on Park Point, if you're familiar with Duluth.
Wow.
And so that's where I was stationed. I got there in July. And so I was on small boats, on search and rescue, and aids to navigation. One of my jobs was painting high structures called day markers.
Okay.
And you had to climb up these structures and about 100 feet in the air and paint all the way down.
I know, how does that work? Do they just tell you that morning that's what you're doing? Do you have the chance to opt out and say, I'm afraid of heights, don't send me up there?
Well, one of the guys who was a first-class boatswain by the name of Culberson, he looked at me and said, hey, you scared of heights? And I said, no. And I wasn't scared of heights. I didn't like them that much, but I wasn't scared of them. So he said, good. He said, you're going to be my day marker painter. I had no idea what it was. So he got all the material together. We jumped in the boat. We went out. And he said, there it is, now you got to paint it.
Was it cold?
No, it was warm. It was in the Duluth Harbor.
Almost pleasant if
Oh,
you
it
had
was.
sort of a Spider-Man willingness mentality.
It was neat. It was good. I did all the painting, and he sat in the boat all day, down below.
Someone has to be there to catch you.
Yeah, right.
No, I was recalling back one of your stories where you were in some type of special unit where you did the different types of marching exercises.
Oh, that was in boot camp.
Yeah,
That was in boot
let's
camp.
talk about that. I think that's very interesting.
When I got to boot camp, they lined us all up, and the guy who was the commander of the honor guard went along and looked at everybody that was 6 feet tall, and that's what he was looking for, was tall guys. And he said, you and you and you, and I was one of them.
This is like a cattle call for actors.
There's a whole bunch of people
Typecast.
standing there, and he's picking out the guys that are 6 feet tall. So he said, I want you to try out for the honor guard. So I mean, what do you do? I said, okay.
Yeah.
So I did, and I made it. And there was 2 different sections. There's the top 16 and the bottom 16. Well, in order to You start off in the bottom 16, and as you get more proficient, then you get to the top 16. Well, I made the top 16 in the first 3 weeks, and I stayed in the top 16. And then we went up and down the East Coast, Atlantic City, and all the different places, and we marched for the VFW, the American Legion, that kind of stuff.
So
and
rather,
it was fun.
yeah, ceremonial.
Yeah, it was. And we had big taps on our shoes and bayonets on our rifles and that kind of stuff. Wow. And we were really sharp. I mean, the guys did a good job. Everybody really did well, and it was fun.
Well, I'm so glad that you have personally preserved so many photos, which are in your book. Mm-hmm. And then you also found from some of your comrades,
you know,
their photos, and those are throughout the book too.
That's so interesting because some of the people I hadn't seen in years, and when I decided that I was going to do the book, I just got a hold of them and asked them if they had any pictures, and every one of them said, "Oh, sure, no problem." And you know, and I said, well, "I'll pay for the postage." "No, don't worry about the postage." You know, they sent me all kinds of stuff and permission to use it.
Yeah.
And this is 40 years later, which is pretty darn good.
Oh my gosh,
yeah.
That's remarkable.
Yeah.
So before we close out, I want you to tell folks how to get your book.
Well, they can order it from Amazon.com. They can also go to Barnes & Noble's. They have it there. They can get it from North Star Press, which is out of St. Cloud.
Out of St. Cloud.
And also I sell them myself. Mm-hmm. I don't have a website. I'm working on a website now. Mm-hmm. So I sell, and then I go from place to place and I give talks, you know, about my time as the last keeper of Split Rock. Yeah. And then I sell and sign books there also. And usually book clubs and historical societies and those types of places.
This is Lori Creever signing off from our interview with Mike Roberts, inviting you to read a book. It could change your life. And let's encourage our children to do the same.